I'd like to
Great.
introduce our guest today, Elina Teboul. She is a leadership expert who coaches influential leaders from around the world. A former attorney at a global law firm and adjunct professor at Fordham Law School, she pivoted to organizational psychology and started her leadership advisory practice. She dedicates herself to philanthropy, which is really meaningful to me. She's on the advisory board of the Earth Law Center, championing new perspectives on environmental stewardship. She is the author of a newly released book right here called Feminine Intelligence: How Visionary Leaders Can Reshape Business for Good. I am so thrilled to have you on today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be having this conversation.
So thrilled to have you. And let's start by having you read an excerpt from the book, Elina, which has been really meaningful to me. And it's called A New Era of Leadership, which will kick off our conversation very nicely. So why don't you go
Wonderful.
ahead
And
and
thank you for asking me to read because actually I don't often do real readings. I feel like I usually launch into speaking. So this is quite a pleasure that you've asked me to do this. I'm very excited. So there we go. A new era of leadership. What should be at the center of our economic universe? A focus on life and love and building a world together that we all want to live in. The degradation of the feminine principle within our cultures and societies and the neglect of our feminine consciousness within us must be stopped if we are to seed a business environment that elevates humanity. A pivot is required, one that embraces feminine intelligence and leads with wholeness. Imagine our collective consciousness transforming the global business enterprise into a passionate pursuit of higher value and innovation. Imagine a revolution of leadership that consistently includes the well-being of humanity among our priorities when we shape short-term and long-term business objectives and strategies. Imagine a global network of leaders like you guys who feel driven to safeguard our beautiful planet even as we pursue greater productivity and sustainable profits for shareholders. Imagine harmonizing the forces of capitalism with the universal ideals of human rights, peace, and preservation of the planet.
oh, thank you so much for reading that. I read that a couple of nights ago. I'm like, oh, that just embodies everything that is so meaningful to me as a leader and how the world, I would like to invite the world to run
Mm,
moving forward. So let's start at the beginning, Alina. And from what you write in Feminine Intelligence, was there a moment when you realized that this message needed to be shared?
mm. Yeah, so I think there were many moments, and a lot of it had to do with my executive coaching work, my leadership advisory work, because I was coaching so many different leaders and men and women individually in groups in teams with so a lot of kind of different vantage points into what real leaders were going through. And what I noticed from a lot of women initially was a kind of disassociation from their authentic self and a real desire to lean into what I call more traditionally masculine archetype behaviors and values. Because let's be honest, that's what we have all been told leads to success. That's what gets
Absolutely.
measured, that's what
Mhm.
get rewarded. But then in our conversations, there was always a dissonance between, well, I should be doing this, but then I really want to be doing something else. I want to show up in a different way. I don't feel joy at work because I'm hiding my true self. I don't feel like I could bring to the table certain issues that are impactful for the world, but maybe not directly tied to the bottom line. And so there was a resistance to bring things that would make them seem, weak or somehow not following the traditional aspect of what leaders were expected to do. And initially I realized that, and I was very personally reading a lot of feminist literature at the time. And I thought, wow, women are really disconnected from this kind of idea of the feminine archetype. And we as women really need to connect to this. And as I continued to dig deeper, and then I would start to float some of this language and some of these ideas with my male clients, I realized that it's actually extremely important that this conversation is gender agnostic, because a lot of this comes with a freedom to express ourselves, but it also sometimes comes with a responsibility, an obligation to step up and act in a different way, show different behaviors, lean into values that are more difficult, and advocate for each other and for the world. And we don't want to put that obligation on the shoulders of women, right? We want to make sure that these principles, these strengths, these values are carried by all leaders. And actually, what's really interesting is that a lot of men were excited to lean into these principles for themselves, because as
Fantastic.
as we're seeing now, men are not necessarily keen to be bucketed into kind of traditional masculine values either. So really these ideas came from working with my clients.
And your journey has woven through law and business and leadership. So you have all of this experience in these different sectors. What is the definition for those hearing it for the first time of female intelligence?
Yeah. And so I'll make sure that we call it feminine intelligence and not
Okay.
female
Okay.
intelligence,
Thank
because
you.
again, it's because it really is not about gender in the way
That
that
was
the
my error.
yeah. We females have a lot of intelligence, and that certainly is something that we can talk about today in a room full of women. But I do think a lot of these principles apply to everyone. So I'll start with just saying that I started my career in corporate law, as you mentioned, and that really influenced these ideas, because I was working in what I would call a pretty toxic male dominated work environment. So I was working in New York City. I was working for Davis Polk, which is one of the kind of big white shoe law firms. And I was in investment management. So you don't get more kind of masculine culture than that. And I was just really surprised again by, I came out of law school and I thought that we were all very idealistic, and we thought that we were, the law is the underpinning of society, and I thought we were going to be doing some really important work. And we never talked about any of those things. We didn't talk about purpose or values or really leadership. We only had conversations in the context of how do we represent our clients and do that in the best way so that we can, frankly, build more hours and make more money. So it was always centered around that. And I was quite dissatisfied. I tried to do a lot of pro bono work, especially with women from Africa with female genital mutilation, which gave me that sense of purpose and actually like connect with
Thank you
clients
for
where I
your work
felt,
doing that.
yeah, that's a really emotional one. Because you would sit with these women who were going through all of these things, and sometimes they would bring their daughters to meetings, and part of it was just trying to make sure that they weren't sent back so that their daughters didn't have to go through this, which was crazy. But I was trying to find like purpose and meaning and do something that I thought was important, and not just bill the hours and make lots of money, which seemed to be the only thing that was really respected and valued in the culture that I was in. And I had this very unique opportunity to leave the law firm to go work for Alan Gray, who created the largest investment firm out of South Africa, which now is in 11 countries with 100 billion of dollars under management. So, very successful business. But his focus was on, and we'll talk about this later, but the ideals of conscious capitalism. And so this personal journey of mine, which I share in the book, of seeing what traditional masculine kind of toxic work environment, and leaving that to work for someone who was undoubtedly making a very successful business. I never say that should be at the expense of making money or at the expense of business, because that's the lifeblood of our economies and very necessary. but it doesn't have to be extractive. And so I was really fortunate to be shown there's a whole other way to lead and a whole other way to do business. So those experiences really underpinned my desire to go back to school, study psychology, and start a leadership practice, because I thought, wow, these individuals who are sitting at the tops of organizations, there's so much power in that, because it's a multiplier effect, right? If you work with conscious leaders, and if you yourself do the work to become a conscious leader, then you can touch so many lives. And I love speaking to all of you here today, because these aren't just ideas. This is for each one of you to be able to implement in your families, in your jobs, because
Absolutely.
each and every person here touches so many other lives, and has, yeah, this the huge multiplier effect, which I really love. So that's kind of where I come from, my lens, my perspective for writing this book. And you asked about the definition, and I always laugh because everyone wants a definition. And I think, well, definitions and language is really this like left brain competency. And it is this linear, rational, logical way of thinking. Like, what are the three components of feminine intelligence? And I and I laugh
That's
because
so true.
actually what I'm trying to advocate for is being comfortable with a bit of chaos and that right brain creativity, the intuition, to say maybe it doesn't need to have an exact definition. And can we be comfortable with a different way of knowing, without knowing that there are three exact components, but understanding that some things are felt and seen and understood from a different part of ourselves. And so, the words that I always use to describe is certainly intuition. And sometimes, especially we as women, we feel like we just know. We know from our gut, we know from our heart, we know from our
Absolutely.
body. It's a heart-centered, embodied way of making decisions that sometimes I can't prove to you with the numbers, but maybe that's okay. And maybe we can start having the conversation to say, maybe that's okay, that I don't have the hard and fast evidence to prove it to you. And that would be equally counted.
Well, I want to share something. This conversation resonates with me so deeply because I left corporate America at 27 and started my own business because it didn't make sense. And I was working for two different women in two companies who led from the masculine. And I'm like,
Mm.
this doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me personally. And I ended up starting my own business a long time ago at 27. And I have led in a more feminine, values based perspective in my communications company here in Seattle. And, we've done really well by doing good. And so we'll talk more about that, but it is a, a switch on that more masculine way of leading. And I like that you don't necessarily have a exact definition of feminine intelligence. But I would like to ask our audience today, what comes to mind when you hear the words feminine intelligence? If you would put that in the chat, that would be great. And we'll get back to that. We'll continue in our conversation and see what people say. But what do you think about when you hear the term feminine intelligence?
And I think here I'd love to just be honest and frank, because when I was interviewing people for the book, there's a lot of stereotypes when we hear the word feminine. And sometimes, especially for senior women leaders, there were negative associations because we have we have so many societal and cultural stereotypes of what we mean by the feminine. And there could be a danger actually in leaning into some things that are not helpful anymore. And like physical version of what we think is the feminine. I always tell people, I really don't care what color your fingernails are. That's not what we're talking about here. When
Oh,
you say
it's not,
feminine.
not at all.
And I had this really interesting experience where sometimes what women would say in a one-on-one context would be different than what they would be comfortable to say, especially in person and kind of a larger group context. And the stereotypes sometimes are that it's too soft, that it's a weakness, that it's not serious, that it's sort of missing the point of, the important business factors. And I always call that out because we need to address and be honest about the stereotype. We have to call it out in order to move on from it. Because otherwise, a lot of people would say to me, the ones who understood the stereotype, they would say, "Why are you using this language? It's outdated. Maybe it's not helpful anymore." And my answer to that is, this is exactly why I'm using this language, because it's in our collective consciousness. We have all used feminine and masculine. It's not going to go away if I hide it under my pillow. If I just pretend it's not there like an ostrich and I don't use the language, I'm not going to ever be able to redefine it and give it the power that I hope that through this book, that all of us here can really step into this feminine intelligence with courage and passion and power. And I
Love that.
wouldn't be able to do that without using the language. So
Absolutely. And
um
let's read a few things from the chat here. So
yeah,
Sally said empathy about feminine intelligence, nurture a
definitely.
holistic view of sharing equity and compassion,
Yes,
human-centered, looking at everything with a lens of humanity, which goes back to the reading that you did from your
yes,
book.
yes.
And I want to read Richard's here about encompasses relationship development and valuing, pursuing the
Mm,
greater good. And
yes.
there are so many things, agree about the stereotype. My career has been based in a heavily male dominated industry, and to be treated separately or seen as a feminine leader did not equate to be positive. But
Oh,
I want to say that there are so many things about having empathy, intuition, and collaboration, and using that on a day-to-day basis that does work. And there is a statistic out there that female-run businesses are much more successful because of these elements. So tell us more.
yes, absolutely. And there are many statistics, and women today are really making strides in educational achievement, in career achievement, which is really amazing to see. And this is what's interesting. I think if you go back in history, then the feminine was associated with the female form. And of course, when we look back at our history, initially women were not in the workplace, and workplaces were designed for men, and women were at home. And so these feminine qualities were associated with the female domestic qualities. And so we made this assumption that empathy and interconnection and nurturing and love were meant for the domestic space because that's what came naturally to women who were at home at the time, and that the male dominated workplaces, which were created for them, were designed for something completely other. And what that creates, I always say that, the patriarchy, it hurt men just as much as women, just in a different way. But it took away from men the ability to lean into these aspects because, of course, it's such an insult to men to say, "Oh, you're feminine."
Right,
men,
right.
men men don't want to be called feminine, and what, that's really interesting to me because they very often, if you look at kind of mental health statistics and what a lot of men suffer from, particularly loneliness, because there's this pressure on this individualistic aspect where the feminine is more connected to relationships and interconnection. And men, they really, like, patriarchy has really boxed men in to say that all of these other aspects, you're not a real man if you're doing those kinds of things. And so one of the most
Which
important
is
things
so
for,
not true.
which is so not true, which is why it was so important to me that actually Raj Sisodia, who's one of the co-founders of the conscious capitalism movement, who is an extremely conscious and incredible man, wrote the foreword for this book because
Which
I
is
really I really wanted for that lens to be there at the very beginning to say this is not about gender, and that men here have an opportunity to bring themselves joy, save our businesses, and show an example, because it's very difficult still for women to lean into aspects of themselves if the men don't do it. And as soon as you have an empathetic and conscious male leader, then the women around that leader will also be able to rise to the occasion and step into these aspects of themselves. So for the men who are listening here today, and for all the women who have, men in your lives, whether it's your, partners or in work, please share this message that this is this is just as much for society, but for men, for themselves too, to find true, like, joy. I did a lot of work in, positive psychology. It was a big aspect of mine because of the legal industry, like the I just would it include valuing being woke? There's a chapter here that's called "Awake, Not Woke Capitalism," which is quite intentional because regardless,
Keep it at awake.
because it's awake, right? Because woke, again, that's a word that has so many different assumptions and biases, and really, I think, separates people and makes really creates sides. And what I advocate for is coming together and not taking sides, and seeing the empathy in each other's perspectives, and finding the humanity in all of us, regardless of our, political opinions. And for me, that's being awake, right? And that's what we're really advocating for here, is that we do the inner work to learn about ourselves, to understand why we have certain viewpoints that we do, and why others have the perspectives that they have, and be able to listen with love and compassion and come together, instead of trying to really take sides, which I think is only good for, like, Facebook and AI and all the people who are profiting from feeding us algorithms that make us think that we're really far apart, when we're really not.
I
And
know
unfortunately,
we're much more alike than we
yeah,
are different. So let's stay
yeah,
there.
yeah.
So one of the things one of the things that is has been so important to me about your book is that you share many examples in your book about success stories around, someone that you've coached where feminine intelligence made all the difference. Can you share maybe a couple of examples where you help someone see that, some like intuition and collaboration, does work and it benefits the team and the company, and the person themselves.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
do you have a couple of examples to share?
Sure. And it's probably every one of my clients that I've ever worked with. And because, we do come in with these assumptions around what success is and what we should do to get ahead. One particular story comes to mind, where there was a woman called Lucy, and Lucy was this. I mean, she's a powerhouse. She's like, based in New York, CEO, founder of a tech startup, and really, like, brilliant leader. And when she came to me, it was because her board was on the verge of firing her, regardless of how brilliant she was, because she was leading entirely in her masculine, and her team was just scared of her. I mean, I always do what I call a kind of 360 a 360 assessment when I work with a senior leader. And I do that by actually having calls with, around 10 people who surrounds that person. And I ask them a lot of questions. And I, after, when I was writing up my report, I kept writing the word fear, because they thought she was so brilliant and so incredible, and they wanted to do their best to please her, but they couldn't bring creative ideas because they were too afraid of being shut down. So fear is the number one stifler of creativity and innovation and collaboration, because if we don't have psychological safety in the workplace, then of course we're not going to bring some wild new idea, because we're too afraid that it could be wrong, or that we could displease our perfectionist boss. And so she was brilliant, but because of the atmosphere she was creating in her team, they were too scared to be honest with her. They were too scared to bring her really great ideas. And so the organization actually wasn't doing that well, even though they had this incredibly brilliant leader. So the board was very unhappy and told her basically she needed coaching. And it took a while before I ever even brought up kind of the language of the feminine with her, because I knew that this is not what she wanted to hear. And we really focused on her stepping into her power and her authenticity and her confidence to say the things that were in her heart, but she didn't think anybody wanted, like nobody wanted to hear that from her. She felt all the pressure of being the leader and all the pressure of, making sure that the numbers work, that she just didn't make the headspace or the heart space to really be there for her team as the inspiring, motivating, empathetic leader that she could be. And when we started to unpack, some of her childhood stories and the
I
narratives
say
that
it all
she,
goes back to
yeah, it
childhood,
it
doesn't it?
always goes, it always does, it always does, and I'm maybe like slightly unique as an executive coach because I did go and do my master's in clinical psychology, and I think a lot of people in coaching, they focus on the problem and they don't focus as much on the person. But I will say that it very often goes back to childhood, to parents, to young adult experiences, and the messages that you subconsciously received from whether it's your family or from the environment that you're in. And we had to unpack some of those, and I call them kind of baby traumas because all of us, every single person listening to this has had trauma in their life. Maybe it's not capital T trauma, but it's, it is these small experiences, on the playground that sometimes they impact us. And they might not sound, big and important to someone else, but they're important to you. And they shape who you are. And that's all that matters, right? Is that they're sitting there in the back of your mind, telling you things and shaping your behavior. So you have to connect to them. So we always have to go back and evaluate, where are these behaviors coming from? And then, we have to do the kind of values exercise of what do you value? Who do you want to be? You decided to be a founder and a CEO more than many other people that I've coached that are maybe, kind of a senior manager within a bigger context. Like you really have power and control over where this organization is going and what do you want it to be in this world? Like, why does your business exist? And when she started answering some of those questions, you could see that she had so much purpose and social impact and desire for positive change. And she wanted to know how her people were doing. She just couldn't connect to them because she's created this bubble of fear. So after 6 months, it doesn't happen
It
overnight.
takes time.
It takes time. But we got her to a place where she could, like, people were crying at the offsite. And she was able to model the behavior, and she was able to be vulnerable, and she was able to share honestly, where she was coming from, and she was able to ask for help to say, if you see me acting in this way, please come to me and let me know, and I really am open to it. And I really not only give you permission, but I can't do this without you, because that's how actual change in behavior happens. So that's one example
What
of
a
kind of
beautiful example.
many similar
Yeah.
examples. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but people need that opening and tools to
Mhm.
help them to,
Yeah.
deal with their past, and they don't necessarily equate, like you mentioned, their
Yeah.
past with how they're leading today. So thank you for helping opening up her, and I'm sure her team thanks you so much. So let's talk about some of the benefits of leading with the feminine. And the first one you call integration.
Yeah. And I just want to respond to Richard here
Oh,
because
okay. I didn't see
I,
that.
I
Thank
couldn't
you.
agree more. In the traditional male organizational culture, there's a fixation on quantifiable metrics, and there are no measures, therefore rewards for holistic interpersonal values. And I think that's a choice, right? Like sometimes people say, we're going to hire the best person for the job. And I'm like, well, what's the best person? Is the best person the one with the, highest SAT score, or
Not
is
necessarily.
is it the person that actually brings people together, that they're the glue, and they themselves might not be the top performer, but guess what? The research shows that when you have a person like that, then the 10 people around them, all of their performance goes up because that person uplifts everybody. So maybe that's the best person for the job, given, where your team is at. And so I think Richard is so correct that our traditional organizations, they're not necessarily looking and measuring and valuing the interpersonal aspect. But I do think that there are organizations that are more innovative and that are starting to really consider these kinds of metrics, and that those star performers that lack in emotional intelligence and in feminine intelligence are not going to be able to stay in their positions of power as people around them basically start to protest. And what's interesting too, I think, we're all fixated on AI these days, and guess what? I mean, ChatGPT can do things much better than most of us when it comes to like the linear, rational, mathematical, scientific work, and getting better every day. And if that's true, if we're having technology take many of our jobs, then what is the future, and what is our role going to be at work? And I really believe it's going to be focused on more of those human elements,
Absolutely.
because that's what's going to be necessary. The AI
Yeah,
can't do that.
right. It's interpersonal communication and connection. And
Yeah.
so let's talk about integration and what you mean by that.
Yeah. So what I mean by integration is really bringing the feminine and the masculine together.
Great.
So I think the initial assumption, maybe from the title, is that feminine is good and masculine is bad somehow, and that's certainly not true. And actually, most people who know me well, they laugh because they say, you've written the book you need, because they think I'm quite masculine in a lot of my behaviors, because I like efficiency. I like productivity. I was a corporate lawyer. Like, I like to get things done. And that's great. And I don't have anything, against that way of being. I think that we need both. And I think that what we need is the capacity to decide, what do I need in this moment, and be adequate at flexing. So right now, what my situation calls for is going into my masculine. But at this other time, actually, I can assess the situation and feel into that this is not going to be helpful right now. And I can listen, and I can take a step back, and I can be softer and trust that that won't be seen as a weakness. And so I have to be a whole person. And Carl Jung, for anyone who's sort of read some psychology, it's like he talked about this a lot, where he called it the process of individuation, where every man has to get in touch with his feminine side, and every woman has to get in touch with her
Yeah,
masculine
both.
side.
We all have both, right?
We
And I
all
would
have
say most
both.
people think that I have more masculine, and yet I try to run from, run the team with the feminine. But
Yeah.
I love getting things done like you do, and I've been called, oh, you're so masculine. I'm like, well, I don't run my company like that. That's
Yeah.
why people have been with me for years and years and years. So,
Yeah. But again, we've over indexed on the masculine, as, Richard here pointed out very eloquently. And I agree with that traditionally our organizations have over indexed. And I don't mean to over index on the feminine either, because there is such an aspect as, the toxic feminine, which could be overly needy and putting others before self and creating resentment and being manipulative. Like, that also exists. And so it's not about choosing one or the other. It's about both. So that's where the integration comes in.
and we've talked about intuition quite a bit. So let's talk about balance.
Yeah, balance. Well, again, I think balance is similar as integration, right? It's the yin and the yang, and to know that we need both, and to have the capability to step into both. And as we talk about this, one of the stories that comes to mind from the book is some of you may have seen this TEDx talk by Jill Bolte Taylor, and she is a Harvard neuroscientist. And I share her story as an example of this idea of, integration and being able to make the choice to step into different aspects of ourselves. So Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, she had a stroke when she was in her 30s, and she completely lost the functioning of her left brain. And I mean, wow, like how interesting is
Her
it
story is amazing.
for a neuroscientist to be able to witness her brain go offline and then witness over 8 years how it comes back, and then as a neuroscientist be able to explain to all of us how it works when you tap into the left brain consciousness or the right brain consciousness. I mean, of all the people who are meant to be given this message. And the way she explains it is like, when she's Jill Bolte Taylor, she's in her left brain. She is separate from the rest of us, and she is efficient and she's capable and she does her work. But then, even if you don't need a stroke to be able to do this, but you can choose to step into the consciousness of your right brain, where there is no I, and we are all one, and we are all interconnected, and we feel love, and we feel the present moment, and we are able to connect with others on a completely different level. And it's a choice. So for her, she was thrown into full right brain consciousness when she was when she was suffering a stroke. For many people, they're able to get into that right brain consciousness through prayer, through dance, through mindfulness, through various psychosomatic tools, and to experience, like, what does it mean when I step out of that person that I'm constantly measuring, and the emotional baggage, and the left brain decision making. So you can practice trying to step into your right brain consciousness so that it becomes more fluid, and you can make that choice in whenever you need, so you can find balance.
And then wholeness.
Again, it's all these words, I think they allude to the same thing, that
Yes.
when we are missing a part of ourselves, then we actually can't self-actualize, and then we cannot focus on the greater good. So the way that I viewed this book is, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, and we're meeting our bottom level needs so that we can move up the level of consciousness to then think about the collective and create businesses that are forces for good in the world. We can't do that as individuals unless we are whole, unless we are complete. Because then all of our energy and all of our focus is on all of those selfish needs that are not being met. We can't possibly start to think further and deeper when we are struggling with our own, whether it's mental health problems, whether it's interpersonal problems. We're so focused on our existing paradigm that until we are whole, until we're complete and integrated, we can't then think about what does society need. And I
Yeah,
think that we're in a
definitely.
place in the world, right? Like, we need our leaders to step up, and we all are those people. And so I think we have a responsibility to look at our own lives and make sure that we can reach that sense of wholeness first, and then from that wholeness and from that place of love, we can start to think, what can I contribute, what can I give?
And that really leads nicely into the conversation about values and congruence and what you call conscious capitalism. And I think that, we were talking earlier about, setting your values from the beginning when you are, either stepping into a leadership role or a new business, and what are those, and having those be congruent with your personal and professional lives. And I will just say, from in my firm, I've done that because we're very conscientious about the clients we take on. We give back. We have a program called Parsons Good Works where we give back to the community. And this is all a part of conscious capitalism. Companies like Patagonia have made a decision from the beginning to lead with those are my dogs, and the mailman just came, just so you know. Um, but companies like that who have led from the beginning with values and congruence have done really well. And I think this is a really important conversation to have about all of the things that you're talking about, Elina, with your book and how businesses can do better.
Yeah. So this buzzword of conscious capitalism, I'm sure that all of you listening have heard it before. And but many of us haven't actually like unpacked like what is this word? You know, it gets thrown around a lot. And a little bit of history is that it was created by Raj Sisodia, who's a business school professor. As I mentioned, he wrote the foreword to this book and is a mentor and a friend. And it was co-created with John Mackey, who is the founder of Whole Foods. And Whole Foods is an excellent example of conscious capitalism and the intentions with which John Mackey created the organization. And then they wrote the book, and there's it's now an enormous organization that does a lot of trainings and helps other companies. But capital there is the capitalism part. This is really important, I think, that profit is important. Profit is the lifeblood of a business, that we are not taking the approach that, capitalism is horrible and business is horrible and that, we all have to get rid of everything, because I don't think that's practical. I also, I came to the US as a child from Russia when I was 6 years old. And for me, capitalism was always this, the American dream, because my parents ran away in the middle of the night. I couldn't say bye to anyone. And like communism is the kind of place that you do run away from in the middle of the night. And so for me, I always thought like, innovation and business and creation and, our ability to pursue all of these incredible things that have, our standards of living are higher than ever. Like this is amazing, and we have to support it. And so I was always very attracted to the ideals of what it could be. Unfortunately, capitalism has morphed into something that is extractive and something that takes advantage of people, and that has elevated, the top 1% and has forgotten about a lot of other people. And so the idea of conscious capitalism is to say, well, profits are good, business is good, we all want to make a living, but can we put love instead of profits at the center of this conversation and create businesses that, yes, make money, but that also take care of our planet, and that also take care of our people, and that also, look at the
Absolutely.
suppliers, and that like these two things are not incompatible, right? That we can create a world which is continuing to have growth and that is continuing to make everybody's lives better, but also like thinking about everybody's lives and not just one very small percentage of people. And so that's the values with which Whole Foods was built. And obviously, Whole Foods became an extremely, extremely successful company. I do know that eventually it was sold to Amazon, and there's a lot of people have
Closes right
different
now.
opinions of on whether it continues to be conscious. And obviously, John Mackey gets asked this question all the time on all the panels, and there's he has a story around why he made that choice, and you could believe it or not, but at the very least, the ideals with which he built
Yeah,
the
the ideas he
organization
built were amazing.
are
And there's so
incredible.
many companies like Tom and Jerry's that, also
Ben and Jerry's,
led
yeah.
from that perspective, and then got bought out by major corporations.
Yes,
So,
yes,
but I think that the essence of what counts as capitalism, whether you're a small company like ours to, huge multinationals, that it's an invitation to
yes,
do better in the world, to do better for people and better for the planet. And
yes.
that's the most important thing.
And I recognize that this is really hard. So I had, funny story that's not in the book, but I had this desire after I wrote the book. I thought, well, maybe I can, start a company with these values. And I got really interested in regenerative agriculture, and I thought maybe I could start like a really
Art.
conscious regenerative regenerative chocolate brand. And it was not meant to be because that's exactly when cacao prices decided to soar. But and because and this is getting into the values conversation, because I said, well, why do I want to do this? I want to do this because I'm very passionate about the environment, and I wanted that to be at the forefront of the company. And I thought, well, my marketing would be around this, my advertising would be around this, and part of it would be to help communities, local communities, to regenerate their land so that they're not just destroying it with, the kind of
Pesticides.
monoculture
Yeah.
that we currently have in the food industry. And so I really wanted to, teach people about agroforestry. And I couldn't make the numbers work. I couldn't. And I had that experience of, well, how can we get the margins? Okay, well, and so then all the advisors start to say, well, just don't do this agroforestry project, right? Because you're a startup, that's too expensive. That doesn't make sense. Maybe once you're bigger, when you're ready to sell to Mars, then
Yeah.
you can start to do these kinds of things. And so that's where the values come in, and I looked at it and I said, well, if I can't do it the way that's aligned with my values, then I actually don't want to do it. And I have to, find a different way that I could do something that does align with my values. But in order to have made that decision, I had to know what my values are in the first place. So most of us probably have not taken the chance to, sit down and write them out. By the way, that they also evolve. So even if you have written out your
Absolutely.
values, it's always good, I would say, once a year to look back and say, does this still make sense for me? Because, we evolve as people, and the world evolves. So I think it's an ongoing process. But if there is kind of exercises in the book that you can
Yeah,
take a look
they're
at.
really good.
Thank you. But I'll kind of, the short version, if you wanted to do this on your own, is 3 to 5 is a really good number. So when you have 10 values, then it's kind of like you're valuing everything, and it becomes really difficult, because the point of having values is to guide your decisions, right? And so if you have so many values and they're all in conflict with each other, and you don't know how you rank them in order of importance, then when it comes time to making a decision, you don't actually have a guiding principle. And so 3 to 5, very well defined. So as an example, if my value is freedom, what does that mean? Does that mean financial freedom? Does that mean freedom of my time? Does that mean freedom to make decisions according to my
Yeah.
values?
You have to be
Like,
very clear.
you have to be very clear, again, because those three definitions of freedom would yield very different behaviors, right? I
Absolutely.
also really encourage people to think about the why of your value. So if it's, and I use freedom because financial freedom was a value for me when I was starting in corporate law, because I did come from immigrant parents, and that was really important to me at the time. And today that freedom has evolved into freedom to live my life in accordance with my values. But there's reasons for, where I come from, for my life situation, to be able to have those different values. So I think being honest with yourself about why something is your value,
Mhm.
because sometimes it helps. You might realize that you write something that's a value that's actually, your cousin's value and your mom's value, and that maybe it's not actually your value, and you don't want it to be your value. So it's a great opportunity to assess, like, where do they come from and are they real, and rank them in order of importance. And then the kind of, last part is, give yourself a rating on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. Like, how are you living in line with that value today? So if freedom is your value and you're living it, maybe only as a 2. So what is one thing that you can do from, now having listened to this until the, let's say end of the month, that can get you just to a 3?
I
You don't
love
have to
that.
go to a 10, but how
Hmm.
can you move yourself from, I'm living it as a 2 today, to I'm living it as a 3 by the end of the month? And what are some small things that you can do to get there?
That is terrific. So we want to talk about some tools. We have about 10 minutes left to get clear about your most authentic self so you can lead with integrity and courage. Will you tell us about your true model?
Yes, sure. And I'm just seeing Richard here again. Thank you for participating. And we need to encourage others to
Yes.
participate as well as Richard.
Yes.
So thank
Thank
you.
you,
We
Richard, as
we love
always.
seeing things. Yeah, we love seeing things in the chat.
Yeah,
And I couldn't agree more. I do this with my teams as well, that you have to define those North Star goals and the why of them, because isn't it shocking, Richard, like how often a leadership team with, 5 to 10 people on it. And when you start asking them these kinds of questions, they have completely different definitions of the values and they have completely different ideas.
absolutely. It's
And it's
so
like,
important to get people on the same page, the whole
yeah, it's like,
team. Yeah.
exactly. It's like, do you guys actually work together? Like, what are you working towards? So that's a really great comment. So the true model, thank you for asking about that. And again, with my leadership advisory work, I thought, well, what are the absolute, like, most essential areas of mastery that are necessary for leadership? And true is sort of funny, called for be true to yourself as a leader. And it stands for time mastery, relationship mastery, mastery of uncertainty, and emotional mastery. And each one of these could be an hour-long conversation, so I won't go too much in depth into all of them. You can read about it in the book, but I would say, briefly, that unless you make time for stillness, for connection to self, for like to hear your own intuition. We keep saying this word, but how can you connect to your intuition? How can you, in all of the noise and everything that is happening in the world, how can you create space between stimulus and response, and in that space connect to your intuition so that you could hear what your authentic self is actually telling you? And I think that's really what, mindfulness and meditation and all of these, practices try to get to, is time for thinking, for feeling, for intuiting, so that you are not just being responsive to you know, the status quo, which is the masculine traditional paradigm. Because if we don't make time and we're just, doing the tasks, then we can't lead to change. The status quo loves for everyone to be super busy, because then you don't have time to really reflect and realize that this isn't working for you anymore. And I think that the most senior leaders that I've ever worked with, the ones that were most respected, were the ones where they had a lot of time on their calendar just blocked for themselves,
Yes, that's so
and
important.
they would not move it. And
Hmm.
actually, I hate to say this, but the women are much worse at doing this, because they will
True.
very often
People
think, well,
pleasers.
yep, something else is more important. Somebody wants to have a meeting, something has
Mhm.
come up, and they
So true.
will get rid of that block time to make space for someone else. Please don't do
Mhm.
this.
Yes, please don't take time for
Please,
yourself. So let's
like,
go to
please
the
don't do this.
R.
Yeah. And so the R is for relationships. Again, the feminine is all about relationships, while the masculine tends to focus more on self and personal identity. And relationship mastery, you obviously as a leader can't get anywhere by yourself. So the book again has some tools and things to think about in terms of having better relationships. Uncertainty, we kind of started with this one, where
Yes.
we again prize so much of things that are clear and certain and easy, and we don't like chaos, we don't like uncertainty. I think a great example, when you think about conscious capitalism,
Mhm.
profits is easy, it's one metric. I can understand that there is certainty. Now you want me to bring like the environment into the boardroom. What does that even mean? Like, how do I decide? Is then like, do I talk to the employees or the customers or the environment? Which takes priority, and how? There's a lot of really complex, difficult questions, and you have to be, willing to step into the unknown And I think that the, most important inner work of leadership is to get this, comfort with uncertainty, to be able to step into the unknown and start asking difficult questions, because again, that's how we move away from the status quo. And the last one is emotional mastery, which is, something that we've been talking about for like 3 decades, but there's still not that many emotionally intelligent leaders. And so start with self, right? Before we can get to relationship mastery, we have to understand ourselves. And it's all the things we talked about our childhoods, our triggers, like why do we see the world in a certain way? There are no such things as bad emotions. It's not about making sure you never feel angry again. It's understanding why a certain specific situation makes you feel like that in the first place, right? And that takes a lot of introspection. So that would be, in a nutshell, the true
In
model.
a nutshell, like you said, we could go on for hours about the true model. Elina, thank you so much for joining us today. She just launched her new book, Feminine Intelligence, and it is so wonderful to have this type of book out in the world. And I hope you share it with all of your friends and family and those in leadership roles. Thank you for joining us. Much success to you as you move along in the world and share your beautiful story. Thank you.